private gallery, bar, book, and games here at Ocean Casino Resort. No fills tonight, but we'll do more fills in the next hour. A lot of conversation there, but let's take a look at the Eagles as they get ready for their final preseason tune-up this Saturday at 1 o'clock on 97.3 ESPN. And a lot of the conversation on the Inside the Birds podcast is about some of the positional battles that are still going on, Geoff Mosher. And do you think a lot of these battles are kind of played out, or do you think there's still some battles to be won?
Well, I think there are still some battles to be won, but I do think that there are some battles that, for example, right guard or outside cornerback opposite Darius Slay, when you see the same person taking reps every single day, be it Mekhi Becton at right guard or Isaiah Rodgers starting with the ones on defense, you start to get a sense that the coaches are fairly settled at those positions, but still looking at their options at other positions like slot receiver or inside linebacker.
So let's start with some of those. Let's go to right guard. You mentioned Becton. He got hurt. He's back at practice today. Are you surprised that he kind of took that job? I mean, we talked a lot about it. You were one of the first people that said, hey, they're going to look at him at guard. And here he is. Not only is he getting looked at guard, he's the guard on this team at right guard. So let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, part of me is a little surprised that he went from a guy playing left tackle pretty much his whole life and in one offseason has acquitted himself all right at right guard. This is where we can't let training camp, though, sort of hoodwink us into believing what's real and not real. I'd really want to see him and what he is like in a actual NFL game at right guard. He's done a nice job of learning the position, of keeping weight down, of being conditioned, and that's great. That was really step one. Step two is, can he achieve longevity here? And let's be fair about why he's starting right guard. I mean, Tyler Steen getting hurt in training camp and then sort of again recently has sort of taken Tyler out of the competition. It hasn't been as much of a competition as you would like because Tyler Steen hasn't been healthy enough.
Geoff, let's go to the slot receiver and see where we are there. I don't know if there's a lot of options, or there might be a lot of options, but there might not be a lot of good options. Give us a read after 2 preseason games and a bunch of, 14 practices. Where do you see slot number 3 receiver?
Yeah, it's a big question mark right now, and I'm going to continue to beat this drum that the slot receiver of this team may not even be on the roster yet. This is about the time where I start looking around the NFL at other rosters and who I think might be, gettable at the cut down day. I look at teams that have deep wide receiver core, right? You look at the Kansas City Chiefs. I know Marquise Brown's hurt, but he'll eventually come back, and they drafted Xavier Worthy. And of course they have Travis Kelce, and you see the bottom of the roster. They have guys like Sky Moore who haven't panned out, or Mecole Hardman, who's been in the league for a while and probably isn't going to be a top 4 receiver for them. You look at the Houston Texans. They've got Robert Woods there and may not make the team and is a veteran who's played the slot. So that just goes to show you that if you look around the NFL, you probably can find some decent veterans who may not be what they once were, but might be a better option for the Eagles, at least to start the season. You can sign them to your practice squad as a veteran, have them active for the first 3 weeks, while you continue to try to see if guys like Britton Covey, Johnny Wilson, Anaya Smith, or Paris Campbell can really handle that role.
Geoff, is that a product of the guys that are there being so underwhelming, or do you think at least to some degree this has been the thought process all along? Like, look, we don't need to go all in. We don't need to invest. We're going to be able to get somebody late in camp, right on the brink of the season. Like, how do we get to this point where a team that has Super Bowl aspirations and is all in, we're talking about a guy that could play a prominent role not being on this roster yet?
Yeah, and Bob, it's a fair question, and it seems like we do get to this point, though, with the Eagles, and I'm sure every team goes through this at some position, right? Last year, it was safety, and even linebacker. They had to bring in Zach Cunningham and Miles Jack, 2 weeks into camp when they realized what they had in Nick Morrow and what they had in Nakobe Dean at that point. Nakobe had gotten hurt, wasn't really cutting it. So it's part of that whole, you can't have a Pro Bowler and be great at every position, but the Eagles are smart enough to know that position like slot receiver can be fungible in this league. And if I can find 2 or 3 veterans just on a couple of rosters who will probably be available that means there's probably another half dozen or so more. And when you've got so much money invested into Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert, you really do have to then find a bargain basement type of answer in your other receiver, your number 3 slot receiver spot. And
I guess,
sometimes
one question to interject would be then, how viable is the number? Is it just like we all say, well, you have to have a number 3 receiver? Does this offense necessitate one? In other words, do they have to have a guy, or is that more, look, if Brown or Smith get hurt, they're really screwed, but they don't necessarily have to have a big number 3 wide receiver?
Right. I think they have to have someone with experience and someone who's functional in that spot. That's why last year, Mike, they had Quez Watkins, and he was functional, but they were still trying to figure out a better alternative. So they brought in the bargain basement guys I was talking about. It started off with Olamide Zaccheaus, and then Julio Jones was in there. And just so you'll probably see that kind of piecemealing again in the coming weeks here if they're not really happy with what they've got. Now, Kellen Moore is also known for using some of his best receivers in the slot. He did it with CeeDee Lamb. He did it with Keenan Allen with great success. So you may see him sort of look now at what he's got after a few weeks and say, I need to start tinkering with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith in there at times, not fully, but at times. CD was a 50-50 guy in the slot for them, and Keenan Allen was almost predominantly slot for the Chargers last year. They had a lot of injuries, but to your guys' point, any injury to A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith that would cause them to be out for a long time would be catastrophic for the Eagles, because they just don't have anybody you could trust right now to win consistently on the outside if those two guys were to get hurt. And the more you play those guys in the slot, like Kellen likes to do, the more you subject them to a little bit more punishment over the middle and getting hurt, which is why they've been so far reluctant to want to do that. So, it's an issue. And if you remember, the Eagles had this issue at cornerback 2 years ago when they had Slay and Bradbury. They had no outside corner. Their number 1 outside corner was Zach McPherson 2 years ago. But guess what? Slay and Bradbury actually played 17 games apiece, made it to the Super Bowl. You thank your lucky stars, but it's hard to go into a year hoping that happens at any position, let alone wide receiver.
Geoff, one of the things I'm trying to figure out here, sorting through the hype, and in recent days, it feels like about the last 7 to 10 days, there's been a lot of hype about the resurgence of Nakobe Dean. And I'm very curious on your thoughts about what you've seen from him and where this has come from and how real is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, Bob, a lot of us are a little bit confounded, I guess. I'd love to have a chat with Vic Fangio where I first shoot him up with some truth serum to get the real – and he's a pretty honest guy to begin with, but I can't for the life of me figure out – I can get if Nakobe Dean was being beaten out by a guy who's played inside linebacker for – 7 or 8 years, or maybe an impressive rookie like Jeremiah Trotter. But right now, Zach Bond, who's never played that position, continues to get first-team reps. And the way it's been described to me is that Zach Bond has been performing well for someone who's just learning the position and trying it out for the first time, which is not necessarily, that's good for Zach Bond. But, week 1, Green Bay, do you want a guy out there who's not, really in tune to playing that position and really experienced? It feels like that begs for the circle to be drawn around him by Matt LaFleur, Jordan Love, and the Packers' offensive brain trust. I would rather have a guy who's been an inside linebacker, who's having good camps and proving himself, and we might get there, Bob. The last 2, we still got, 7 or 8 practices, I think, and a preseason game. It seems like they're just making Nakobe really earn and prove that he belongs there. But I have a hard time thinking right now he's not number 1 or number 2 as far as their best inside linebacker.
So he looks good compared to what else is in the room.
Exactly.
What does that look like up against the rest of the league? Are we talking about a league average player? Look, there's a lot of projection going on here, right? But are we talking about a guy when you look at him and say,
I make sure to say this every time I talk about the inside linebacker position, that when we're having this discussion, right, we're talking about they look good for what an Eagles inside linebacker is. If once the season starts, that's a whole different issue, right? Nick Morrow looked kind of good at times, but at the end of the day, an Eagles inside linebacker compared to like a Packers inside linebacker or some other teams year in and year out, has not really measured up.
So you're telling me on Friday night, that week 1 game in the second quarter when we're chasing guys, I'm saying, Geoff Mosher told me that this guy looked good in camp. What's going on here? I can't hold you to it.
That's why I always
much,
try to qualify it as, camp doesn't mean a whole lot, and it's an Eagles inside linebacker.
Right. Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds podcast, football at 4, 97.3 ESPN. Give me your assessment of where the corner room, it started with a ton of names. Where are we now?
Yeah, I think I had mentioned this to either Josh or you, Mike, before you went on vacation for a little bit, but I was starting to get the sense, the way the coaching staff was talking about Quinyon Mitchell, that they were playing him at the nickelback spot because they were trying to be the most dynamic, athletic secondary they can be. And if you play Quinyon at the nickel, it allows you to play Isaiah Rodgers outside. Whereas if you played Quinyon Mitchell outside, you have to go back to like Avonte Maddox at nickel or Tyler Hall or somebody who's not as fast, not as young, not as athletic. So they were going for the best combination as long as Quinyon Mitchell proved he can handle it, which he has proved so far. And that may be the way it looks week 1. But as they get Cooper DeJean integrated into the defense and integrated especially at nickel corner, that will eventually enable them to move Quinyon Mitchell to his natural outside position. I do believe that will eventually wind up happening unless Isaiah Rodgers just plays at a Pro Bowl level on the outside and Quinyon Mitchell's doing so great at nickel. And then you can then have Cooper DeJean be a backup outside corner, right? But I don't think that that's how it's going to shake out. I think what you're going to do is DeJean eventually will get in there at nickel, and that'll move Quinyon outside. And then you'll have a really nice backup corner in Isaiah Rodgers, which the Eagles really haven't had in a long time, a good, solid, veteran backup cornerback.
One of the things that the Eagles have philosophically always sort of hung their hats on is the pass rush. And, hey, maybe we're not going to invest so much at linebacker. There might be a hole in the secondary, but they can get after the quarterback. I guess when I look at this roster, I see the upside, I see the potential, but I don't feel as secure about it as maybe I have in years past. What's your overall evaluation of what the defensive line looks like as a whole, and really, I guess more specifically, their ability to affect the quarterback?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, Bob, because for the long, the Eagles are so known for investing in the trenches and for having sort of those veteran pass rushers, whether it's Fletcher Cox from the inside, right, or Hassan Reddick they had there for a few years on the outside, and before him you had Chris Long, and you always had Fletch, had Brandon Graham. I mean, they've just always had good pass rushers who aren't just good, but they're proven guys. You just knew going into the year what you could expect from them. And it does feel like, not the reset button, but it does feel like there's less proven commodities out there in their pass rush outside of Josh Sweat, who still, even after dropping off last year, I think you can safely say is a proven commodity. He just has to reprove that he's still a really good pass rusher, and that the last half of last year when he was just chasing sacks is not an issue anymore. But guys like Bryce Huff, who was a designated pass rusher, a third down pass rusher for the Jets, sure, the numbers were great in pass rush, but now he's got to be a full-timer. Nolan Smith, sure, first-round pick with a lot of bend and explosion, but we have to see it now. Brandon Graham's probably not going to play a ton of snaps. Jalix Hunt is a third-round pick who's looked nice in camp, but was sort of considered a project. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely fair to say, these aren't the tried and true Eagles pass rushers of the past, but they all kind of come with a pedigree or a resume where they're supposed to be good at it. And I think Jalen Carter will be a pretty good interior pass rusher, but again, he's just in year 2 as well.
And more specifically, Nolan Smith. To me, he feels like the make or break player in all of this. Because if he does not perform, what is the alternative? What is it, more Brandon Graham? So, what do you see from
I would almost ask if Huff is a make or break player.
I guess, and I suppose so. But when I look at it, I guess I'm expecting something in year 2.
My question was almost like, are we not talking enough about the lack of pass rush? Like, is that something we're taking for granted, that Bryce Huff's just going to come in here and rush the quarterback, Josh Sweat's going to bounce back and rush the quarterback, and Nolan Smith is going to – he gave you nothing last year. Is all of a sudden he going to be, Matt Strom and be an all-star?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have talked about it. It's just, it sort of takes a backseat a little bit to the issues that they've had at inside linebacker and safety. But it's certainly a fair question. And I think Nolan Smith is a big microscope guy because he probably fits Vic Fangio's defense better than Josh Sweat because he can drop back and rush the passer with a little bit more fluidity, whereas Josh Sweat, you really don't want him dropping into coverage much. And Vic Fangio, I've been telling this to Mike, Bob, get ready for this. You're going to see a lot more, maybe more than you've ever seen as an Eagles fan, of what we call sim pressures, which is blitzing inside linebackers but dropping edge rushers. So it's still going to be a four-man rush, but it looks like a blitz because somebody's coming at the last minute and then someone's dropping at the last minute. You want a guy like Nolan Smith with his athleticism to be able to do that. You don't want a guy like Josh Sweat dropping and trying to figure out where he's supposed to be, covering the hooks and the flats there. So Nolan Smith fits what they want to do, but he's got to be, he came to camp at 245, which was bigger than last year. He's got to show that he can play the run. And he just like Huff, they have to show that they're more than just situational pass rushers.
Geoff Mosher, is there any guys that don't get a lot of conversation or didn't have a lot of buzz entering camp that have worked their way onto the roster or into the conversation entering the final preseason game on Saturday?
Well, Jalix Hunt was a third-round pick, and from Houston Christian, and the thought process was, he played at such a small FCS level school. He's going to need a year of seasoning, redshirting, playing on special teams, but he's had a pretty impressive camp. So, to your point on what if you don't get what you're looking for out of Nolan Smith or Josh or Bryce Huff or Josh Sweat, I wouldn't be shocked if they throw Hunt on the field early to see what he's made of and see if he can contribute as a pass rusher. Certainly Jeremiah Trotter Jr. as a fifth-round pick was someone who you're like, it's a fifth-round pick. He's not the greatest athlete in the world. That's why he's a fifth-rounder. But his instincts are very advanced. And the more he shows up in camp, the more you wonder with the unclear picture at inside linebacker if he won't be getting a shot to play in certain packages on defense. And then offensively, I would say Britton Covey is a guy who's proved so far in camp that he can separate as a receiver and probably deserves more of a look than just punt returner.
All right, Moshe. Well, Saturday at 1 o'clock, we'll start to get more answers to some of these questions. We won't see any starters in this game. Are you okay with that? No offense at all again this preseason?
What makes me a little more okay with it is the fact that they finally realized that they went a little bit too far to the extreme on training camp practices over the years and now actually have real practices that go an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then they have, the joint practices that they've done. I think that makes it better. If they were still doing this 45-minute practice where the first 10 minutes is stretching and the next 10 minutes is individuals, and then you got like 20 actual minutes of real drills, then I would be pessimistic about what they're doing. But now I think that because they have real actual contact practices that go longer than 45 minutes and upwards of an hour and a half to 2 hours, they'll be in good shape.
All right, Geoff Mosher, of course, the Inside the Birds podcast is out. It's a fresh one. Get it wherever you listen to your podcast, and, of course, right here on Football at 4 on the Sports Bass. All right, Moshe, talk to you, buddy.
All right, fellas, have a good one.
That's Moshe, and, of course, he'll be back on Wednesday. Adam's here tomorrow. Andrew will be in on Thursday, and we'll preview the game with Adam on Friday. And, of course, you can listen to the game right here